In the last video, we left off discussing the idea of decomposing this net effect from a wage increase into its respective income and substitution effects. To do this, we need to recognize foremost that as a result of this increase in wages, the budget constraint has rotated up, and this person chooses a new optimal tangency. They go from U1 and 16 hours of leisure to U2 and 15 hours of leisure. Let's first decompose, isolate the income effect of this change. To do that, we're going to get rid of the budget constraint that changed, because we're going to imagine that wages haven't changed just for a moment. And we're left with this. So all I've done is, if you notice, removed the rotated budget constraint, meaning that we don't really have a wage increase at this point. But we do know that because of that wage increase that we saw before, this person is going to get to U2. They are going to reach a higher indifference curve. So we're leaving that here in our model. Now we're going to create a hypothetical and say, if this is the indifference curve that this person is going to get through from a higher wage, let's imagine how we could get to this same indifference curve through a non-wage income effect. Remember, a non-wage income effect comes about from getting income outside of work. The example we used in a previous session was grandpa gives you an allowance every day. If we stick with that, we might say, how much of an allowance would grandpa have to give you a day to shift this budget constraint up to be tangent with that indifference curve too? Another way of putting it is, how much of an increase in income per day would you have to get you to the same indifference curve we know that that wage increase that really happened gets you to? And the answer to that is illustrated right there. So if grandpa gives you money to get you to the higher indifference curve, he would have to continue to give you money until your budget constraint moves up this much. If he did that, your optimal allocation would be U2 prime. You would in fact increase your leisure from 16 to 17 hours. That means that the income effect is 1 hour more of leisure. Of course, this is hypothetical. This income increase did not occur, but it gives us the ability to understand how the income effect would get us to the same indifference curve as the wage increase got us to, and therefore isolate the actual income effect of the wage increase. We didn't end up at 17 hours of leisure. We didn't end up at U2 prime. We actually ended up at U2. Recall, after the wage increase, we were here at 15 hours. So the difference between where the income effect got us, 17 hours, and where we ended up must be the substitution effect. And that's 2 hours of decreased leisure. So let's summarize. We started at 16 hours of leisure. The income effect got us to 17 hours of leisure. The substitution effect then took us to 15 hours of leisure. So the income effect is 1 hour more leisure, and the substitution effect is 2 hours less leisure. The process through which we determined the income and substitution effect was, first, create a hypothetical income effect, and then compare that outcome to the real outcome that the wage increase caused. Now let's look at a labor supply curve for a market and how the labor supply curve relates to what we've learned in our indifference curve budget constraint model. In this illustration here, we've got our hours of leisure on the horizontal and the various incomes on the vertical. You'll notice we have different wages. Wage 1 would be $1, wage 2 is $2, so on and so forth. We also have this person's indifference curves. And we can trace out the optimal outcomes for leisure by looking at the tangencies of their indifference curves at every wage. For example, at a wage of $1, this indifference curve tangency is right here at U1. This person would choose 16 hours of leisure and 8 hours of labor work at $1. Next to this model, we can create a labor supply curve. The labor supply curve has the wage rate on the vertical and the hours of work on the horizontal. For example, if the wage is $1, we just learned that this person will work 8 hours. So 8 hours is our point. U1 here, U1 here. Of course, if the wage goes up to $48, there is a new tangency at the higher indifference curve. U2 is the new optimal outcome. At this point, the choice of leisure is 13 hours, and thus the choice of work is 11 hours. So at $2, we have 11 hours of work. U2 here corresponds to U2 here. This process continues. As the wage goes up again, we reach a new tangency. As it goes up again, we reach a new tangency, and then another tangency. But notice what's happening in this model. As the wage goes up, at first we're seeing decreases in the amount of leisure, and thus increases in the amount of hours worked. But once the wage goes from $3 an hour to $4 and to $5, we actually move in the other direction. Higher wages begin to bring about more leisure. Once we go above $3, higher wages bring about less hours of work. This is known as a backward bending labor supply curve, and it is something that we almost always see for individuals across the broadest array of wages. Example, you might say if your wage goes from, I'm just making up numbers, let's say $10 to $20 to $30, that you would work more. You might further say that if this continued to 40 to 50, you would continue to work more. So you would just have an upward sloping positive response to wages. But I guarantee at some wage rate, you will start to work less. Maybe for you it's $100 an hour. Maybe for someone else it's $20 an hour. And maybe for other people it's $500 or $1,000 an hour. But for every individual, there is this inevitable curvature that occurs in the supply curve. At some wage, people start to respond to increases by working less. There is an intuition behind this as well, and that's what I want to talk about next. The substitution effect dominates at low wages, and it's likely because when you have a low wage, income is scarce compared to leisure. In contrast, someone with a higher wage would likely have leisure that is scarce relative to income. As a result of this, we see the responses vary across wage rates. Here's an example. If someone is young and they're making minimum wage. Let's just say that that's $15 an hour. And that wage goes up to $20 an hour. Well, that increase is about 33%. And that's going to induce a large increase in labor supply because that person has very little income. Income becomes more valuable. Think about what income means to someone that has a small amount. That extra 33% might be getting a car, or being able to go out to a restaurant, or maybe even take a vacation. So income becomes very valuable relative to leisure, and the response is, I want to work more so that I can now get take advantage of that higher wage rate. Alternatively, somebody that is older, middle-aged, or in their peak earning years, for them, they might have a lot of income and a lot less leisure. So leisure becomes scarce to income, and their response to an increase in wages might be very different. Somebody that makes $150,000 a year, if they see their wages go up to $200,000, well, that's a 33% increase. But they're already working a lot. They're making income. They've got the car. They've got the house. They're taking the vacations. They can go out to restaurants. That extra income doesn't mean much to them relative to the leisure that they're sacrificing. So at this point, those higher wages result in an income effect, and they end up working less. You can almost chart this out in the work-life cycle. Of course, age is just one example where this often plays out, but it's not a given. There are some people that are older that have very low wage rates and a strong substitution effect to increases in their wages. And there are some people that are younger that have high wage rates and have a strong income effect that is leading them to work less. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg is fairly young, but as the CEO and founder of Facebook, he saw his wage rates skyrocket pretty fast. And I suspect that caused him to think about working a little bit less than he otherwise would. Thus, the income effect may have dominated his increase in wages, even though he was still fairly young when that occurred. Now let's talk a little bit about the empirical evidence on labor supply. We build a lot of models in economics, and those models are used to explain correlations that we believe exist and make predictions. But they're only as valid as the data supports them in the real world. So let's see how our model holds up. Before we do this, understand that the backward bending labor supply curve applies to individuals. When we move from individuals to groups, we may not see a backward bending supply curve. For example, men, we have a slightly backward bending curve, but generally a 10% increase in wages leads to a 1% increase in supply. So that backward bending is likely occurring at a very high wage. And again, you've got men, not young men or old men, so it's general with both. Well, for women that are single, it's an upward sloping relationship. A 10% increase in wage leads to a 1% increase in supply without a backward bending element. For married women, it's also upward sloping, with a 10% increase in wage leading to a 4% increase in supply. Interesting difference here, and significant. Married women tend to be more responsive to a wage increase than single women. In other words, the substitution effect is greater for married women than for single women. Why? It's possible that having a spouse at home to take on some of the household responsibilities is facilitating married women to enter the labor force, whereas single women might not have that advantage. These trends are changing, and there are certainly other factors at play. But one important thing to note is there is a big difference between many of the stats of single women and married women. Not so much between single men and married men. So that's why we separate these out